The sound of a pen scratching across paper shouldn't carry weight. It's just ink and movement. A reflex as automatic as breathing. But at 14:30 hours on a Tuesday in October, inside the administrative wing of Naval Base Coronado, the scratch of Colonel Crawford's pen across 14 signatures felt like something being sealed shut forever. He set the pen down and pushed the folder to the edge of his desk with the detached efficiency of a man signing off on a supply order. Nothing more, nothing less. 14 names, 14 identification numbers, 14 military working dogs scheduled for termination within 48 hours. "No one wants them," he said, not looking up from the next document already waiting beneath his hand. "They're a budget liability. Handle it." Master Sergeant Claudette, standing at the corner of the room with her arms folded and her expression carved from something harder than satisfaction, nodded once. Beside her, Captain Kingsley scanned the list with the practiced detachment of someone who had learned long ago not to attach names to numbers. 3 buildings away, in the long concrete corridor of the kennel facility that smelled of antiseptic and damp earth, and something that could only be described as the particular grief of working animals removed from their purpose, a woman on her knees was scrubbing the floor of kennel number 7. She wore the gray uniform of a civilian contractor. No rank, no insignia, no name tag beyond a laminated badge clipped to her breast pocket that read, W. Richardson, Contractor Level 2. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun that suggested habit rather than vanity. Her hands moved the mop with the mechanical rhythm of someone whose mind was somewhere else entirely. Staff Sergeant Silas pushed through the double doors at the far end of the corridor, a printed memo folded once in his hand, and walked the length of the kennel block with a pace that was slightly too deliberate for a routine errand. He stopped behind her. She didn't turn around. "Willa," he said. She sat back on her heels, took the memo, and read it. The kennel block was quiet except for the low movement of dogs shifting in their enclosures. She read the list once, then she read it again, slower. 14 names in the thin bureaucratic font of a finalized decision. She recognized most of them, not from records, but from something older and harder to name. She stood up, smoothed the front of her uniform, and set the mop against the wall. Silas watched her. "Willa, which office is he in?" "Colonel Crawford, the main administrative—" She was already walking. 10 minutes later, she stood in the doorway of Colonel Crawford's office. She was not an imposing figure, 5'4", lean, the kind of quiet that doesn't announce itself. She had the look of someone accustomed to being overlooked, which is a different thing entirely from someone who has not been seen. Crawford glanced up from his desk, registered the gray contractor uniform, and his expression settled into the particular variety of tolerant impatience that senior officers reserve for people who have wandered somewhere they don't belong. "Can I help you?" "I want to take the dogs," Willa said. "I'm sorry?" "The 14 on the termination list." She held up the memo. "I'll take all of them." The silence lasted exactly 1 second before it broke, and what broke it was laughter. Master Sergeant Claudette, who had not left the office, unfolded her arms and let out a short, clean note of amusement that held no warmth whatsoever. Captain Kingsley turned from the window. Even the administrative specialist at the desk near the door looked up. "You'll take all of them," Claudette repeated, her voice the precise instrument of someone who has spent years perfecting public condescension. 14 combat-trained working dogs. You'll take all of them." "Yes." Crawford leaned back in his chair and studied the woman in the doorway, the way a man studies an object that has appeared somewhere. It clearly doesn't belong. Not with hostility, not yet, but with a measured curiosity that contains the seed of dismissal. "What's your name?" he asked. "Willa Richardson, Contractor Level 2, Kennel Maintenance." "And where exactly are you planning to house 14 military working dogs, Ms. Richardson?" She did not answer immediately. Not because she didn't have an answer, but because she understood that the question wasn't really about housing. "I have the means," she said. Crawford smiled. It was the kind of smile that closes a conversation rather than opens one. He picked up his pen. "Friday," he said. 1600 hours. If you can complete and submit a full civilian adoption application, all 47 pages, with the required facility certifications and behavioral management credentials, I will review it." He paused. "All of it must be in order, every page, every signature." He let the pen rest against the paper. If the paperwork isn't complete by 1600 and Friday, we proceed as planned. He looked back down at his work. You can go now. Willa looked at him for a moment longer. Then she turned and walked out without another word, and the laughter that followed her down the hallway was the kind that doesn't require volume to carry. She counted it as she walked, 42 hours, and she thought, I've worked with less. If you've ever watched someone get dismissed simply because they didn't look the part, stay with us. Willa just walked into a system designed to break her in 42 hours, 14 dogs, a mountain of military paperwork, and 5 officers who've already decided she'll fail. What happens next isn't what anyone in that room expected. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the moment this all flips, because it's coming faster than they think. The kennel block at 0530 the following morning was lit by the pale overhead fluorescence that hummed slightly, a frequency that most people wouldn't notice, but that Willa had long ago cataloged along with every other environmental detail she encountered automatically, without effort, the way some people breathe. She had been there since 5, before the morning shift arrived, before the base stirred into its daytime noise. She stood at the far end of the row of enclosures with the termination list in her hand and did something that Silas, arriving early to check on a dog with a minor injury in Block B, noticed from the doorway and couldn't quite interpret. She wasn't reading the list, she was looking at the dogs, moving her gaze from one enclosure to the next, slowly, methodically, her lips barely moving. Not reading their ID placards, not consulting paperwork, just looking at each animal with the focused stillness of someone recognizing faces in a crowd. Silas stood in the doorway and watched her for almost a full minute before she sensed him and turned. You're early, he said. So are you, she replied, and went back to what she was doing. He set his coffee on the edge of a supply shelf and watched her move to the small desk in the corner, a repurposed footlocker with a flat surface bolted to the top, and begin filling out the adoption paperwork by hand, section by section, with the focused efficiency of someone who has filled out high-stakes documents under time pressure before. He noticed the way she held the pen, not the loose grip of someone writing casually, but the tight, controlled hold of a person who has spent years writing field notes in conditions where the paper moves. He didn't say anything about it. Master Sergeant Claudette arrived at 0800 with 2 junior staff members she'd pulled from their regular assignments for no clear operational reason, and she brought them to the kennel block in the manner of a tour guide pointing out local curiosities. This, she said, gesturing toward Willa's corner desk with a theatrical openness that invited her companions to share in what she clearly considered a remarkable spectacle, is what hope looks like in administrative form. She let that settle before continuing. 47 pages, 42 hours, one civilian contractor who has, apparently, decided that the laws of time and federal bureaucracy don't apply to her. One of the junior staff, a young specialist named Priscilla, glanced toward Willa and then back to Claudette with the uncertain expression of someone who hasn't yet decided which direction to lean. Willa did not look up from the paperwork. You know what the facility certification alone requires? Claudette continued, her voice carrying the comfortable authority of someone who considers expertise a social weapon. A structural assessment by a licensed K-9 facility inspector, licensed for military-grade animals specifically, a veterinary compliance review, a behavioral management protocol submitted in writing by a certified handler. She paused for effect. Not a certified dog trainer, a certified handler, military working dog handler, different thing entirely. Still nothing from the corner desk. Claudette tilted her head slightly, the way people do when they're recalibrating to get a better angle on someone who isn't performing the expected reaction. I'm trying to help you, she said, and the word help in her mouth had a particular texture, smooth on the outside, solid and immovable underneath. There are 2 civilian shelters within 40 miles of this base that might take 3 or 4 of the less compromised animals. That's realistic. That's achievable. What you're attempting is neither. Willa looked up. She looked at Claudette for exactly long enough that the silence became something with weight, and then she said, I appreciate that, and went back to the paperwork. Claudette's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes shifted, a small recalibration, subtle as a compass needle adjusting. She turned to her companions, and the 3 of them left, and if her footsteps were slightly sharper on the way out, No one mentioned it. Silas, who had been reorganizing supply inventory at the other end of the block with focused deliberateness that had nothing to do with inventory, caught Willa's eye across the corridor. She gave him nothing, just a small, contained look that might have been acknowledgement, and then she turned the page. Affirmed. Holly Carter, the other civilian contractor assigned to the kennel block, arrived at 0845 with the particular energy of someone who has been running 5 minutes late every morning for 2 years and has made peace with it. She dropped her bag on the supply shelf, pulled her hair back, and stopped when she saw Willa's desk. "How long have you been here?" Holly asked. "Since 5? In the morning?" "Yes." Holly looked at the stack of completed pages, counted the sections still remaining, and performed the kind of rapid mental arithmetic that doesn't require expertise to produce an alarming result. "Willa, 47 pages in 40 hours now. 40 hours. Holly sat down on an upturned supply crate and studied her colleague with the expression of someone who has just been presented with a puzzle they didn't ask for and can't walk away from. "What do you know about military working dog certification requirements?" Willa turned a page. "Enough. That is not an answer. It's the one I have right now." Holly opened her mouth, reconsidered, and reached for her own coffee instead. "I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." "Okay. Have you done this before? Filed a military K-9 adoption application? Because the way you're moving through those sections," Holly gestured toward the stack, "most people would be Googling what half those acronyms mean." Willa did not answer immediately. She finished the sentence she was writing, set the pen down, and looked at Holly with the measured steadiness of someone deciding how much of a true thing to say. "I've filled out a lot of paperwork under pressure," she said finally. Holly looked at her for a long moment. "That's still not an answer." "No," Willa agreed, picking up the pen again. "It isn't." Captain Kingsley came at 0915, and he did not bring companions. He pulled a chair from across the room without asking permission and sat down directly across from Willa's desk with the systematic authority of someone accustomed to conducting assessments. "I'm going to ask you some questions," he said. "Go ahead." He opened a standard review clipboard. "Income source. How are you planning to sustain the financial requirements for 14 animals? The feeding, veterinary, and maintenance costs alone represent—" "I have documentation of sufficient personal assets," Willa said. "It's in section 12. He moved to the next line. "Living space. Military working dogs classified at behavioral risk level 3 or above require a minimum outdoor facility of 400 square feet per animal, enclosed, with a covered structure meeting USDA Class 2 standards." She didn't look up. "My property meets those requirements. Inspection certification is attached as Exhibit C." Kingsley paused. He hadn't expected her to have Exhibit C. He looked at the paperwork, found the exhibit, reviewed it briefly, and moved on. "Behavioral management methodology. Can you describe your approach to handling animals with documented aggression and trauma response?" She finished another sentence before answering. "Graduated exposure protocol. Consistent command structure. Recognition of individual stress response patterns rather than application of blanket methodology." She paused. "The short version is, I don't treat them like problems to be solved. I treat them like individuals who have been through something and need time and someone who isn't afraid of them." Kingsley wrote something, then he stopped writing and looked up. "I'm going to ask you something that isn't on the form," he said. "All right? Delta 7. You're aware of Delta 7? The briefest pause. "The German Shepherd in enclosure 14. "Yes. He's attacked 4 handlers in the past 3 months. The last incident required medical evaluation. No one goes near that enclosure without a minimum of 2 personnel and full protective equipment." He studied her. "He's on your list." "He is." "Why?" Willa finally set the pen down and looked at Kingsley directly. "Because he's the one who needs it most." Kingsley held her gaze. "That's a sentiment. I'm asking for a methodology. The handlers he attacked, were they approaching from his left or his right?" Kingsley blinked. "What?" "His attack pattern, left or right approach. Which was it?" Kingsley looked at his clipboard. The information wasn't on it. He looked back at her, and something in his expression had shifted from the professional impatience he'd carried in with him to something less certain. "I'd have to check the incident reports," he said. It's right side, Willa said quietly. He attacks right side approaches, because his last handler was left-handed. Every command, every approach, every movement was from the left. He learned that the right side means something wrong is coming. The kennel block was quiet. That information, Kingsley said carefully, is not in the standard records. No, Willa agreed. It wouldn't be. The silence that followed had a texture to it. The particular quality of a room in which something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Something that has shifted the ground by a fraction of a degree. Not enough for most people to notice, but enough for the compass needle to point somewhere new. Kingsley stood up, collected his clipboard, and walked toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. Section 31, he said without turning around. You'll need the counter-signature from the veterinary officer on record. Dr. Peterson's office is in Building 14. He left. Willa picked up her pen. Silas, who had been in the storage room at the far end with the door open 6 inches, exhaled a breath he hadn't been fully aware he was holding. Major Fletcher arrived at 10:45 without announcement or preamble, which is how people arrive when they consider the announcement unnecessary. He was a broad-shouldered man with the efficiently contained posture of someone who has spent a long time in operational environments and carries the physical discipline of that time without apparent effort. He had a specific kind of stillness, not calm, but controlled, and he stopped in the doorway of the kennel block and looked at Willa with the focused attention of a man who has been given a briefing he considers insufficient. "Ms. Richardson," he said. She looked up. "Major." He walked to her desk, set down a folded schematic, and opened it on the surface beside her paperwork. It was a technical diagram, a K9 tactical harness assembly, fully disarticulated, each component separated and labeled with military identification numbers. "I've been informed," he said, "that you're attempting to requisition 14 military working dogs for civilian adoption." His tone was neutral, in the way that a judge's expression is neutral, not warm, not hostile, withholding judgment while building a case. "I'd like to understand what qualifies you to manage animals at behavioral risk classification 3 and above. I have the certification documentation in section." "I'm not interested in documentation right now." He tapped the schematic. "Reassemble this. Correct configuration for night deployment. Standard protocol." Holly, who was filling water bowls 3 enclosures down, stopped moving. Willa looked at the schematic. Then she looked at Fletcher. Then, without a word, she picked up the components that he had placed beside the diagram and began reassembling the harness. Her hands moved with no hesitation, no reference to the schematic, no trial and error. The pieces connected in sequence, strap to buckle, mounting plate to frame, quick release to primary load point. And the silence in the kennel block took on a new quality. The held breath quality of people watching something happen that they can't immediately categorize. 45 seconds. Dr. Elaine Peterson, the base veterinary officer who had come to co-sign Section 31 and had arrived in time to witness the entire sequence, pressed the stopwatch button on her phone and looked at the display. She looked at the assembled harness. She looked at Willa. "Standard protocol," Major Fletcher said, his voice carrying no emotion, "requires a minimum of 3 minutes for trained handlers." He picked up the assembled harness and inspected it. "This is correct." He set it down. "Who trained you?" "I've had good instructors," Willa said, and went back to the paperwork. Fletcher stood there for a moment longer than the situation seemed to require. Then he turned and walked out of the kennel block, and Silas watched him pull out his phone the instant he cleared the door, dialing with the purposeful speed of someone who has just moved a priority up the list. Holly waited until the sound of Fletcher's footsteps faded, then crossed to Willa's desk and leaned down to speak quietly. "That harness configuration," she said. "I've seen it in training footage. Old footage, classified access footage that got circulated online a couple of years ago." She paused. "That's a SEAL K9 unit configuration." Willa turned a page. "Willa, I heard you. Did you hear the part where I said SEAL K9 unit?" "Holly." Willa looked up, and her expression held something that was neither denial nor confirmation, but something between the two. A door left neither open nor shut. "Finish the water bowls." Holly looked at her for a long moment. Then she went back to the water bowls. Carter arrived at 11:30 with the specific energy of a man delivering news he has been looking forward to delivering. He was a mid-grade administrative officer with the efficient manner of someone who understands that bureaucracy is its own form of authority, and he had clearly spent some time composing the expression he wore now, the expression of professional regret worn by people who feel no regret whatsoever. "Ms. Richardson," he said, stopping in front of her desk, "I've reviewed your application materials, and I need to inform you that item 14 requires a facility certification bearing the endorsement of a licensed military working dog facility inspector, specifically licensed under the DODK-9 Classification Tier 2 standards." He held out a printed notice. "That licensing body does not conduct expedited reviews. Standard processing time is between 4 and 6 weeks. Willa took the notice, read it. "Which means," Carter continued, allowing himself one small uplift at the corner of his mouth, "that the required certification cannot be obtained before Friday's deadline. I'm afraid the application cannot proceed." The kennel block was quiet. "The JAG office," Willa said, her eyes still on the notice. "Can I stop by this afternoon?" Carter blinked. "I'm sorry?" "The Judge Advocate General's office. I have a regulatory question about certification and substitution under emergency humanitarian grounds." She set the notice down. "What are their hours today?" "The JAG office is—" Carter stopped. "They're closing early today. Internal staff matter." Willa looked up at him. "The JAG office," she said, and her voice had the particular measured quality of someone who is not raising it because they do not need to, "maintains 24-hour operational availability under DOD Regulation 27-10. They don't close early." She held his gaze. "But I appreciate you checking." The corner of Carter's mouth had returned to its neutral position. He looked at her with the recalculated expression of a man who has played a card and watched it be identified at the table. He left without another word. Silas appeared from around the end of the row. "How did you know that regulation?" Willa picked up her pen. "I read a lot." People who read a lot don't reassemble tactical harnesses in 45 seconds. "Silas, I'm not asking you to confirm anything," he said quietly, moving closer and lowering his voice. Delta 7. You knew which side he attacks from. That's not in any record that a civilian contractor would have access to. The enclosures around them held their various sounds, the low movement of animals, the soft percussion of paws on concrete, the breathing of 14 creatures who had spent their working lives being certain of their purpose and were now certain of nothing. Willa set the pen down. "When Delta 7 came back from his last deployment," she said, not looking up, "he had a stress response trigger that presented as right-side aggression because of a specific incident during extraction in Kandahar. That incident isn't in the standard records because it happened during an operation that generated a classified after-action report, not a standard handler incident log." She paused. "The handler who was with him during that extraction, he understood Delta 7 better than any record could reflect. And after that deployment, the handler didn't come back." Silas was quiet. "So yes," Willa said, "I know which side he attacks from." She picked up the pen. Silas stood there for a long moment. Then he walked to the end of the row, sat down on a supply crate, and said nothing, which was his way of saying something very clearly. She went to the JAG office at 1300 hours, and she went through the side entrance that required knowing it existed, which most civilian contractors did not. The duty officer, a young lieutenant named Adam, looked up when she approached the counter, and something crossed his face that was gone before it fully registered. Not recognition exactly. The ghost of recognition, or the reflex of it. He looked at her badge, looked at her face, and then reached for the phone. "Just give me one moment," he said, and turned away. She watched him speak quietly into the receiver. She watched the slight change in his posture midway through the conversation. A straightening, subtle, but present. He listened for 15 seconds, said, "Yes, sir," and hung up. He turned back and processed her certification substitution inquiry with complete professional efficiency, signing the relevant documentation without further commentary. But when she turned to leave, he said, "Ma'am." She looked back. He held her gaze for a moment with an expression that had navigated past formality and arrived somewhere more direct. "Good luck," he said. She held that for 1 second, gave him a small nod, and walked out. At 1400 hours, Willa stood in front of enclosure 14. Delta 7 stood at the back of his kennel, watching her. He was a German shepherd of substantial build, 103 pounds when last recorded, black and sable, with the structured alertness of an animal that has been trained to assess everything in its environment as a potential variable. The intelligence in his eyes was not the soft intelligence of companion animals. It was operational, directed. He did not approach the front of the enclosure. He watched. Captain Kingsley had positioned himself at the corridor entrance, along with Claudette, Holly, and Dr. Peterson. An audience that had arrived with the inevitability of people who have heard about something and don't want to miss it. "I want to be clear," Kingsley said, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone who has constructed the terms of an arrangement and intends them to hold, "that this is the standard I'm setting. If you want Delta 7 included in your application, you will demonstrate that you can enter that enclosure without protective equipment and bring him to the exercise yard using verbal command only." He paused. "No handler has accomplished that in 90 days. No handler has tried it from the left side," Willa said. She looked at Delta 7. She looked at him the way she had looked at the paperwork, with full attention, no performance, nothing in the look that asked anything of the observer. Just a direct and patient attention, the kind that doesn't flinch and doesn't push. Then she crouched. She crouched down to his level, 4 feet from the enclosure door, and she said something. Not loudly. Not in the carrying command voice register that handlers are trained to use. She said it quietly, and the only people close enough to have any chance of hearing it were Silas, who was standing 3 feet behind her, and Dr. Peterson, who had taken 2 steps forward out of professional reflex. Neither of them caught the full word. Silas caught the shape of something, a name maybe, 3 syllables, not Delta 7. And then the kennel block became very still. Delta 7 stopped being still in a different way. The tension left his posture, not all at once, not dramatically. It was a gradual release, like a breath let out slowly, and what remained was a different kind of attention. He came forward. He came forward, and he sat. 3 feet from the door, 2 feet from Willa's face, he sat and looked at her. Claudette's hand tightened on her radio. Dr. Peterson had stopped moving entirely. Holly had both hands pressed flat against the supply shelf behind her. Willa reached out, slowly, deliberately, palm down, and rested her fingers briefly on the top of Delta 7's head through the enclosure bars. He did not move. His tail moved. Once, twice. She stood up, unlatched the enclosure, opened it, and extended her left hand, fingers slightly curled, thumb out. A gesture that held a specific shape, a configuration that Holly recognized from something she had seen in archived training footage, and Silas recognized from the shape of something he couldn't fully name, but felt the weight of. Delta 7 walked out of the enclosure and stood at her left side. She led him down the corridor toward the exercise yard, and the only sound in the kennel block was the rhythm of his paws on the concrete and the compressed silence of 5 people renegotiating what they thought they knew. Major Fletcher was standing near the exercise yard entrance. He had been there for 8 minutes, and he had his phone out, and he had typed a name into the DoD personnel database that required a clearance level he hadn't used in 14 months. The search was still processing. He watched Willa bring Delta 7 into the yard. He watched the dog, the animal that had required 2 trained handlers and full protective equipment just to receive a routine veterinary examination, walk beside this woman in a gray contractor uniform with the settled, measured compliance of an animal that has found the person it was looking for. Fletcher's phone buzzed. The search result appeared on his screen. He read the first line. He stood completely still for the next 6 seconds, and then he looked at Willa with an expression that had passed through several intermediate stages and arrived at something that could only be described as the particular stillness of a man who has just understood something that changes the shape of the last 24 hours entirely. He walked, quickly, quietly, back toward the administrative wing, and the phone was already at his ear before he reached the door. Colonel Crawford appeared in the exercise yard at 15:45 with the bearing of a man who has made a decision and has come to deliver it in person, out of a sense of procedural fairness that does not extend to reconsidering it. He looked at Willa, who was sitting on the ground of the exercise yard with Delta 7 at her side and Section 38 of the adoption paperwork balanced on her knee. "I've reviewed your application materials," he said, "and I've spoken with Major Fletcher and with the Administrative Review Board. He clasped his hands behind his back. Based on your documented background and the absence of verifiable credentials appropriate to the behavioral risk classification of these animals, I'm unable to approve the application. He met her eyes. This is a final determination. The yard was quiet. Holly had stopped moving near the gate. Silas stood beside the water station, his hands still. Crawford waited for the objection, the argument, the emotion that the situation seemed designed to produce. People cried here sometimes. People raised their voices. People invoked fairness as though it were a lever that moved institutional decisions. Willa looked at him. Then she looked down at Delta 7, who had not shifted from his position at her side. She set the pen down on the paperwork, reached over, and rested her palm flat against the dog's back. She spoke so quietly that Crawford had to process it afterward, reconstructing the words from fragments. "I'm not going anywhere." She did not say it to Crawford. Silas heard it from 6 feet away and heard the 3 words at the end that Crawford missed entirely, the ones that the wind half took, but that Silas caught the shape of, "not leaving you." Crawford turned and walked back toward the administrative building. Inside the kennel block, at the precise moment Crawford's footsteps faded, Major Fletcher's phone screen lit up on the desk where he'd left it, face up, visible from the doorway. And the name on the return database query, visible to anyone standing close enough, was not a name that appeared in contractor files. It was a rank, and beneath the rank, a unit designation. And beneath the unit designation, a list of service theater notations that included, among others, Kandahar Province, 2009, and Mosul, 2011. And 2 additional entries with classification markers that replaced the location data with a sequence of asterisks. Holly was close enough to read it. She read it twice. She walked to where Silas was standing and said nothing for a moment, just looked at the exercise yard, where Willa was sitting with the paperwork and the dog, and then she said, very quietly, "Silas?" "I know," he said. "You read it?" "I didn't have to." Holly looked at him. "How long have you known?" "Since she told me which side Delta 7 attacks from," he said. "I just didn't know how to say it." The exercise yard was gold in the late afternoon light, and Willa sat in it with 14 kilograms of German Shepherd pressing warm against her side and 31 pages of completed paperwork in her hands. And she looked, in that light, like many things, like a civilian contractor in a gray uniform filling out forms, which is what everyone had been seeing, and like something else entirely, which is what some people were only now beginning to see. Somewhere in the administrative wing, a phone rang. "You've seen what Willa can do with the dogs. Now the question is whether the paperwork, the politics, and the people trying to bury her file can stop her. This is the part of the story where most people would walk away. She won't. If this story is hitting different for you right now, drop a comment telling us which dog you think she saves first, and make sure you're subscribed. The reveal is 60 seconds away. At 16:10, Ronan arrived at the main gate of Naval Base Coronado with a visitor pass that bore the kind of clearance code that gate security personnel are trained to process without commentary, and he walked through the base with the particular economy of movement that belongs to men who have spent a long time navigating environments where drawing attention is a liability. He was older, late 50s perhaps, with the broad-shouldered build of someone who had once carried significant physical capability and still retained the structural memory of it. He wore civilian clothes. His hands were the hands of a man who has worked outdoors for many years in ways that left their mark. He found Willa in the exercise yard at 16:20, and he crossed the open ground toward her with the directness of someone who knows exactly where they're going and has given up on approaches. Delta 7's ears went up. He oriented toward the approaching figure, assessed, and this was the thing that Silas, watching from the gate, would think about afterward. The dog's posture settled, not dropped, settled, the particular release of tension that belongs to an animal that has recognized something familiar. Ronan stopped 6 feet away. "They found you," he said. "I know," Willa said. "Not Crawford, the others." She looked at him. "How long?" "Long enough that you need to decide something." He glanced around the yard, a reflex, automatic, the sweep of a man with old habits. "I can have you moved. New assignment, clean documentation, different base. 2 hours, maybe 3. Willa looked down at Delta 7, at the file folder on her knee, at the 14 kennels visible through the gate. "No," she said. "Willa, no." She picked up the pen. "Not this time." Ronan was quiet for a moment. He looked at Delta 7, who was looking at Willa. He looked at the paperwork. He looked at the 41 pages she had completed. "You know what happens if they pull your cover," he said. "Yes." "And you're still saying no?" "Yes." He exhaled, a long, slow breath that held several things it didn't put into words. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and took out a sealed envelope. He turned it over once in his hands. It bore the official seal of Naval Special Warfare Command, and it had been closed with the particular care of someone who understands that what's inside it matters. "Then you should probably have this ready," he said, and held it out. She looked at the envelope for a long moment without taking it. Then she took it and set it on top of the paperwork. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He turned to go, stopped. "Delta 7, he said. "He remember you?" Willa looked at the dog. "From the first word," she said. Ronan walked back the way he had come, and Silas, who had been close enough to hear the conversation, but far enough to pretend otherwise, stood at the gate and watched him go, with the specific expression of a man who has run out of categories for what he's been witnessing, and has decided to simply let it be what it is. Inside the administrative wing, Major Fletcher had not gone home at 1500 as his schedule indicated. He was at his desk, and beside him was a young signals officer named Luke, who had been brought in on a quiet request and was running a cross-referenced personnel query through a system that most people in the building didn't know existed. The query was taking longer than usual, which meant, Fletcher knew, that it wasn't not finding anything. It meant it was finding something and deciding how much of it to show. He watched the screen, waited. 1642. The result came back, and Fletcher read it. And he sat back in his chair, and he looked at Luke, who had also read it, and was now looking at the wall with the expression of a man who has opened a door he expected to be a closet and found a corridor. "Who else has clearance to see this?" Fletcher asked. "At this base," Luke said. 3 people, maybe 4. "Admiral Jasper." "Yes, sir." Fletcher picked up his phone. "Get me through to his office," he said. "Tell them it's priority 1. The base was moving into its evening rhythms, the particular shift of sound and light that marks the boundary between the working day and whatever comes after it. But in the kennel block, the lights were still on, and Willa was still at her desk, and the stack of completed pages had grown to 38, and outside enclosure 14, Delta 7 was lying with his nose pointed toward the corridor where she sat, his eyes half closed, but his ears still tracking every sound. Tomorrow would be Friday. 31 hours, 20 minutes. She turned to page 39. The base at 0400 had a particular quality of silence that Willa had learned long before she learned most other things. The silence of a place that is never fully asleep, only breathing differently. The kennel block held its own version of it. The low sound of 14 animals in various states of rest. The occasional shift of weight. The soft percussion of a tail against concrete. She had not left. Page 43 was in front of her, and the overhead fluorescent above her desk had developed a faint flicker sometime around midnight that she had noted and set aside. Her coffee had been cold for 2 hours. She had not replaced it. Silas found her there at 0430 when he came in early, again for the second consecutive morning, with the particular purposefulness of a man who has decided that something matters and has arranged his schedule accordingly. He set a fresh coffee on the edge of her desk without a word and went to check on the animals, and the silence between them held the comfortable texture of people who have arrived at an understanding without the inconvenience of having to negotiate it. By 0600, she was on page 46. By 0715, she turned the last page. She set the pen down. She sat back in her chair, the first time she had sat back in approximately 11 hours, and looked at the completed application. 47 pages, every section filled, every attachment cross-referenced. The certification substitution documentation from the JAG office clipped to section 14 with a precision that made the stack look like something that had been assembled over weeks rather than across a single sleepless rotation. Silas came to stand beside her and looked at it. 42 hours, he said. 40 hours and 40 minutes, she said. It's done? It's done. He looked at it for another moment. I'll take it to the administrative office when they open at 0800. "I'll take it myself," she said. She stood up, picked up the stack, and squared the edges against the desk with 3 precise taps. "But thank you." Carter was at his desk at 0803 when Willa walked in and set the completed application in front of him. He looked at it. He looked at her. He looked at the thickness of the stack, the precision of the assembly, the attachment tabs color-coded in a sequence that suggested either military administrative training or the specific obsessive care of someone who understood that there were people in this building who would look for any reason to return it. He picked up the top page and began reviewing it with the methodical slowness of a man who was looking for something and hoping to find it. 4 minutes passed. He turned to section 14. He read the JAG certification substitution documentation. He set it down. "I'll process this and forward it to Colonel Crawford," he said, and his voice had lost the particular music it carried when he'd come to tell her about the licensing requirements. "Today?" Willa said. It was not a question. Carter looked up. "Today," he confirmed, with the expression of a man who has run a play and watched it fail and is now professionally obligated to execute the original mission regardless. She left. Behind her, Carter sat for a full 30 seconds before picking up his phone. The call he made was not to Colonel Crawford's office. It was to a number he'd been given by someone 2 evenings ago, someone who had suggested that certain administrative outcomes could be shaped by people who understood how documentation moved through a system. The phone rang 4 times and went to voicemail. He set it down, looked at the application stack, made a second call, this one to Crawford's office, and began the forwarding process with the careful deliberateness of someone who has just run out of options. Colonel Crawford called Willa into the formal conference room at 10:30. This was different from his office. The conference room carried the institutional weight of decisions that are meant to be witnessed, and Crawford had populated it accordingly. Claudette sat to his right. Carter sat at the end, legal pad in hand. Captain Kingsley stood near the window. Major Fletcher sat apart from the others, slightly removed, and Willa noticed, with the peripheral attention that cataloged things without directing focus at them, that he was not sitting in the manner of someone who is assembled to oppose. He was sitting in the manner of someone waiting for something specific to happen. Willa sat in the single chair across from Crawford. "Your application has been reviewed," Crawford said. He folded his hands on the table. "It is, I'll acknowledge, more complete than I anticipated." A pause that contained several things. However, the review board has identified a concern that supersedes the application itself. He held her gaze. "Your employment records indicate a background in private sector canine training, specifically a facility in San Diego. That facility was cited for a safety protocol violation 3 years ago, and you were listed as the supervising staff member on duty at the time of the incident." Carter had placed a printed document on the table, and Crawford slid it across to her. Willa looked at the document, read it. "This is going to become the basis," Crawford continued, "for a formal review of your civilian contractor credentials. Pending that review, I'm unable to proceed with the application." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm not unsympathetic to what you're trying to do, Ms. Richardson, but I have an institutional responsibility that takes precedence." The room waited. Willa set the document down. She looked at it for a moment, not at Crawford, at the document, with the focused attention of someone reading something very carefully for the second time. Then she looked up. "I need to speak with Admiral Jasper," she said. The silence that followed had several layers. On top, the composed institutional calm of a senior officer being presented with an unexpected request. Beneath that, the particular quality of a room in which several people are deciding how to respond to something that doesn't fit the script. "Admiral Jasper," Crawford said, "doesn't meet with civilian contractor personnel. He'll meet with me." Claudette's expression shifted, a small recalibration, the same one from the previous morning, but sharper now, less settled. "Ms. Richardson," Crawford said, and his voice had taken on the careful quality of someone handling something fragile by preference rather than necessity. "I understand that you're frustrated." "I'm not frustrated," Willa said. Her voice was entirely level. "I'm making a request. If you're unable to facilitate it, I'll find another way to make it. But I'd prefer to do this properly." The room was quiet. Fletcher, who had not spoken since Willa entered, cleared his throat. "Wait," he said. Every head in the room turned. Fletcher looked at Crawford with the measured steadiness of a man who has been sitting on information and has decided the time for sitting on it has passed. "Before we take any further action, I think we should see what's in the application. All of it." Crawford frowned. "We've reviewed not the paperwork," Fletcher said. He looked at Willa. "The envelope." Willa reached into the interior pocket of her jacket and set the sealed envelope on the table. It sat there with the particular gravity of objects that are small in physical dimension and large in every other sense. The Naval Special Warfare Command seal was visible on the closure. The paper was the specific weight and texture of official classified documentation. Crawford looked at it. He looked at Willa. He looked back at the envelope. "Where did you get this?" he said. "It was given to me," she said. "By someone with the authority to give it." "This is—" Carter started. "Carter," Fletcher said, and the way he said it was quiet and final, and Carter stopped. Crawford reached forward and picked up the envelope. He broke the seal, an act that felt, in the silence of the room, like a door being opened, and unfolded the document inside. He read the first line. The room did not change visibly. The overhead lights remained on. The ventilation continued its low background hum. Outside the window, the base pursued its ordinary Friday morning, but Crawford's face changed. Not slowly, not in the graduated sequence of someone processing information and arriving at a conclusion. It changed the way a landscape changes when the sun comes out from behind a cloud. All at once, the same features rearranged by a different light into something unrecognizable from 30 seconds prior. He stood up, not dramatically, not the explosive rising of someone acting from shock. He stood up the way people stand up when they remember that they are supposed to be standing, the muscle memory of protocol engaging before conscious thought caught up. Kingsley took the document from Crawford's lowering hand, read it, and then did something that Silas, who had positioned himself near the conference room window on the pretense of checking the exterior kennel gates, watched from outside and would describe later to Holly with the particular exactness of someone recounting something they want to make sure they're remembering accurately. Kingsley stood at attention, not parade rest, not the relaxed stance of an officer in an administrative setting. Full attention, heels together, shoulders square, chin level, the involuntary posture of a military body responding to the presence of rank it has been trained to recognize. Fletcher held out his hand for the document, read it, set it face down on the table, and looked at Willa with the expression he had brought into the room, the waiting expression, now resolved into something that held, among other things, a quality that was the closest thing to apology that a man like Fletcher would produce in a professional setting. He gave her a single nod. Claudette took the document last. She was the slowest reader in the room, or perhaps she was reading it more than once. When she set it down, her hands held it for a moment longer than necessary before releasing it. And when she looked up at Willa, the architecture of her expression, the structure she'd been building and maintaining since the previous morning, had developed a visible crack. Carter reached for the document. Ronan had entered the conference room through the door at the far end at some point during the past 30 seconds, and no one had announced him and no one questioned it. Ronan's hand came down gently on Carter's wrist. "Your clearance level," Ronan said quietly, "doesn't cover what's on that page." Carter looked at Ronan's hand on his wrist, looked at the room, made the calculation that the room presented to him, which was the calculation of a man who has just found himself on the wrong side of a very large equation. He sat back. The conference room was quiet for a moment that stretched itself out to the exact length required by the weight of what had just happened. Then Crawford said, "Why didn't you tell us?" And Willa said, "Because I didn't want this." She said it without accusation, without heat, with the flat, honest exactness of someone answering a question they were asked, rather than delivering a prepared line. And somehow that made it heavier than anything else that had been said in the room. "I didn't want the rank," she continued. "I didn't want the file pulled. I didn't want anyone standing at attention or reviewing classified documentation." She looked at the envelope on the table. "I wanted 47 pages of paperwork processed before 1600 hours today so that 14 dogs don't get put down in a building where I can hear them breathing." The room held that. Admiral Jasper came through the door. He had not been announced, and the door had not been opened for him. He opened it himself, which is how men arrive when they consider the announcement a formality they've outgrown. He was in his late 60s, with the particular composed authority of someone who has held serious responsibility for long enough that authority has stopped being something he performs and started being something he simply is. He looked at the room, at Crawford, who had moved to a position that was functionally attention without having been ordered to it, at Kingsley, who was still at attention, at Fletcher, who had risen, at Claudette, who had straightened in her chair in the reflex way of a body that remembers what rank means before the mind catches up. He looked at Willa, and he stood at attention. The room seemed to inhale. Admiral Jasper, 4 stars, Naval Base Coronado, Naval Special Warfare Command, raised his right hand to his brow in a salute that was precise and full and entirely voluntary, directed at a woman in a gray civilian contractor uniform sitting in a conference room chair. Willa rose. She returned the salute with the automatic correctness of a body that has not forgotten what it has learned, regardless of how long it has been asked to pretend otherwise. "It's been a while, Commander," Jasper said. "Yes, sir," Willa said. "It has." The title, Commander, moved through the room like a change in atmospheric pressure. Carter's expression underwent a visible reorganization. Claudette set her hands flat on the table. Kingsley, still at attention, seemed to settle further into it, the posture deepening rather than releasing. Jasper looked at Crawford. "The application," he said. "Where does it stand?" Crawford's voice had the quality of a man finding solid ground after unexpected turbulence. It's complete, sir. All sections, ready for approval." "Then approve it," Jasper said. "Yes, sir." "Today." "Yes, sir." Jasper looked back at Willa. "Walk with me," he said. The exercise yard was empty at that hour, and the morning light was the particular clean gold of coastal California in October, the kind of light that makes everything look like it has been considered before being placed. Jasper walked with his hands behind his back. Willa walked beside him, and they covered the first 30 feet in silence, which was the kind of silence that belongs to people who have known each other long enough to not need to fill it. "How long have you been here?" he asked. 7 months. 7 months, he repeated. Not an echo, a consideration. "And you were in San Diego before that?" "Briefly." He nodded. He stopped walking and turned to look at the kennel block. "The dogs," he said. "How many of them do you know?" 9 of the 14, she said. "The other 5 came from units I wasn't embedded with." "And Delta 7? She was quiet for a moment. "He was with Reyes," she said, "during the Kandahar extraction. Reyes was left-handed." She paused. "Reyes didn't make it back." Jasper looked at the kennel block. "I know," he said. "I signed the notification." They stood there for a moment together in the ordinary weight of that. "I need to offer you something formally," Jasper said. "Active duty reinstatement, or reserve classification, or civilian consultant with full special access clearance. Your choice of operational scope." He looked at her. "You don't have to answer now." "I know," she said, "but I need you to know the offer is genuine, not ceremonial." He held her gaze. "What you built, the K9 integration protocols, the handler pairing methodology, the trauma response framework, it's still in use. Every operational K9 unit in the Pacific Theater is running on work that came from your team." "I know," she said again, quieter. "Then you know why I need you back." She looked at the kennel block, where through the gate she could see the outline of Delta 7's enclosure and the shadow of the dog within it, angled toward the yard. "Not yet," she said. "Ask me again in 6 months." Jasper nodded. He said nothing else about it, which is the mark of a man who understands the difference between a no and a not yet, and has learned when pressing one will turn it into the other. "The application will be fully processed by 1400, he said. "I'll make sure of it personally." He turned to go, then stopped. "Ronan, he brought you the envelope?" "Yes, sir." "He's been watching out for you." "I know that too," she said. Jasper allowed himself a small, composed expression that was adjacent to a smile. "You always did know everything that was happening around you before anyone told you." He began walking back. "That was either your most useful quality or your most exhausting one, depending on who you were asking." "Probably both," Willa said. He went back inside. She stood in the yard, and Delta 7 appeared at the gate, his ears up, his eyes on her with the settled attention of an animal that has located the thing it was looking for and has no intention of looking away. The conference room had a different quality when Willa returned. The same people, the same furniture, the same October light through the window. But the room had been rearranged at some invisible structural level, the way a physical space is rearranged when the power in it has redistributed. Crawford sat with the application in front of him, pen in hand, and his manner had the formal correctness of a man executing a duty he had been wrong about and is now executing carefully. He signed the approval form, set the pen down, slid it across the table. Carter was no longer in his seat. No one mentioned this. His legal pad, still on the table, had the quality of an object left behind by someone who departed faster than expected. Fletcher stood near the door. He crossed to Willa, extended his hand, and she shook it. A single clean exchange, the kind that holds more in it than most longer conversations. "The harness," he said. "I want you to know, it wasn't a test I expected you to pass." "I know," she said. "Where were you trained?" She looked at him with the patient, contained expression she had been wearing for 2 days. "By good people," she said. "Most of them aren't around anymore to be named." He accepted that. He nodded once. He left. Claudette was the last person in the room, besides Willa. She stood near her chair, and she had the particular posture of someone who has arrived at a place in a conversation they didn't plan to reach and isn't entirely sure of the terrain. She didn't apologize. She looked at Willa and said, "If you need additional personnel for the first week, intake, documentation, behavioral assessment support, I can adjust the schedule." Willa looked at her. "I appreciate that. I mean it." "I know you do," Willa said. And then, because it was true, and because truth was the only thing she'd offered anyone in the past 42 hours, the offer you made, the first day, the shelters that might take 3 or 4 animals, you were trying to help in the way you understood the situation. Claudette held her gaze. "But it wasn't the right help." "No," Willa said, "it wasn't." Claudette nodded once with the contained precision of a person who is filing something accurately and permanently. She picked up her folder and walked out, and her footsteps on the corridor floor had lost the particular sharp edge they had carried since Monday. At 1400 hours and 12 minutes, Willa stood in front of the 14 enclosures with the signed approval document in her hand. She looked at the row of gates. She thought about the order of things, about protocol and sequencing and the trained precision of process. And then she set the document on the supply shelf and walked to the far end of the corridor. She lifted both hands. The gesture she made was not a standard K9 command. It was not in any civilian training manual. It was a sequence, palm forward, then down, then a single lateral movement at hip height, that existed only in the operational playbooks of units that maintained classified operational records. Units that had developed their own internal signaling system across years of fieldwork in environments where voice communication was a liability. 14 enclosure doors, opened one by Silas at her direction, swung out in sequence. 14 animals emerged, not together, not in the chaotic simultaneity of released animals, but in the deliberate sequence of trained working dogs responding to a command they recognized, moving with the measured purpose of animals who have not forgotten what they are, regardless of what the last year has tried to make them believe about themselves. They assembled. The word sounds too formal for what it was. They moved to her, and the movement arranged itself into a line with the organic precision of bodies trained to formation. And they sat, one by one, until 14 dogs were seated in the corridor of the kennel block in a line that would have been unremarkable on an operational base, and was, in this context, as extraordinary as anything Silas had ever seen in 12 years of military service. He stood at the far end of the corridor and counted them. 14. He looked at Holly, who had come to stand beside him. She was looking at the line of dogs and then at Willa, who was walking the line slowly, stopping at each animal, making eye contact, a brief touch of her palm to the top of each head, moving on. She remembered every single one, Holly said. Her voice was quiet and held something that had not been there on Monday morning. "Of course she did," Silas said. Evan, the young handler who had been assigned to afternoon kennel checks and had arrived to find something that bore no resemblance to an afternoon kennel check, stood near the supply entrance with his hands at his sides and his expression holding the particular quality of a person who is 26 years old and is watching something they will describe accurately for the rest of their life without ever quite being able to convey the actual weight of it. He waited until Willa had completed the line. Then he stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said. She turned. "The hand signal," he said. "The one you used." He held her gaze with the directness of someone who has decided to be straightforward because it's the only currency he has. "Could you teach me that?" Willa looked at him. She looked at him the way she had looked at Delta 7 through the enclosure bars on the previous day, with the full, patient attention of someone assessing something genuine. "Come back Monday morning," she said. 05:30. "Yes, ma'am." "And Evan." "Ma'am." "Bring your own coffee. I'm not sharing mine." It took him a second. Then he smiled, the full, unguarded smile of a young man who has been, without ceremony or announcement, admitted to something. Dr. Peterson found Willa in the exercise yard at 15:30, with a folder of preliminary assessments. "3 of them," she said, setting the folder on the bench beside Willa. "Based on today's behavioral observations and my physical review, Delta 7, Bravo 3, and Echo 9, their injury profiles and behavioral presentations are within rehabilitation range for service redeployment." She paused. "I've written it up as a formal assessment. I'll be forwarding it to Major Fletcher's office." Willa looked at the folder. "What changed your assessment?" "2 things," Dr. Peterson said. She sat down, which was not her typical mode of professional communication, and suggested that what she was about to say had been considered. "First, seeing them respond to you. The behavioral indicators I've been reading as trauma-fixed aggression patterns. Watching them respond to your commands, I've had to reclassify those. They're not fixed patterns. They're trained responses to environmental variables. That's a completely different thing." She folded her hands in her lap. "And second, I want to be honest with you about the second thing. Please, I should have looked harder at what these animals needed, rather than at what the system said could be done for them." She met Willa's eyes. "That's a professional failure on my part. I've been here 3 years, and I learned to work within the parameters I was given. That's not a defense, it's an explanation." Willa looked at her for a moment. "The 3 that can be redeployed," she said, "I'd like to stay involved in their transition program, if that can be arranged." "I was going to suggest the same thing," Dr. Peterson said. She left, and Willa sat in the yard with her folder and the late afternoon light and the sound of Delta 7's breathing 3 feet to her left, and the compound quiet of a day that was almost done being the kind of day it had been. Ronan came at 16:45. He came to the exercise yard and did not sit, stood a few feet away with his hands in his jacket pockets, and looked at the 14 dogs distributed across the yard in various states of rest and cautious exploration of the new freedom of open space. "The call came in," he said. "I know." "You got a call?" "Different number, same message." He looked at her sideways. "Ghost Shepherd." "Yes." Ronan was quiet for a moment. In the yard, Delta 7 had moved to lie with his flank against Willa's leg, his eyes half closed in the posture of an animal that has stopped bracing for things to change. "There are 6 other units," Ronan said. 3 Pacific Theater, 2 Atlantic, 1 that I can't name because I don't actually have clearance for it, which means it's probably yours." He looked at the dogs. "The people who ran the network are still running it. The operational architecture is still intact, and there are active assets in 3 of the 6 units that don't have handlers anymore." "Dogs," she said. 41. She was still. 41 dogs, she said, without handlers. "That we know of," Ronan said. "The full tally is probably higher." She looked at the yard, at the 14 animals who had, as of 1400 hours and 12 minutes today, transitioned from a termination list to a different future. She looked at Delta 7 against her leg. She thought about Reyes, who had been left-handed, who had not made it back from Kandahar, whose dog had spent 90 days attacking handlers from the right side because the right side had been where things went wrong. She thought about 41. "Tell them," she said slowly, "that I need 6 months. The animals I have now need a proper rehabilitation framework before I can scale it. If I rush it, I'll lose the methodology." She paused. "And tell them that any dog coming through this program gets the full protocol, not the expedited version, the full one. They won't like the 6 months. They'll like the alternative less." Ronan allowed himself a small expression that had lived on his face before, in different circumstances, under different conditions. "Same Willa," he said, Did you think I'd changed? Honestly, he looked at Delta 7. No, but I'd have been happy to be wrong. He pulled out his phone, typed a 2-word message, and sent it. Looked up. One more thing, he said. The person who called you, the unknown number. Do you know who it was? I have a guess. It was Harris. She held very still for a moment. Then, Harris is supposed to be in protective custody. Harris is supposed to be a lot of things, Ronan said. Apparently the program he was running, Ghost Shepherd, was his before it was anyone else's. And he seems to think you're the only person who can keep it from going completely dark. He pocketed his phone. He said to tell you the 6 dogs he sent you the coordinates for, back in 2013. He said you'd remember. She looked at the yard for a long moment. I remember, she said. Colonel Crawford came to the exercise yard at 17:15. He was not accompanied by anyone, and he did not have a clipboard or a folder or any of the administrative apparatus that had been the architecture of their previous interactions. He walked across the yard and stopped 10 feet from where Willa sat, and he stood there in the way of a man who has rehearsed something and arrived at the location of the rehearsal, and is now not entirely sure the rehearsal was adequate preparation. Willa looked at him and waited. I reviewed the application, he said. I know, you signed it. I also reviewed... He stopped, restarted. I was given a briefing this afternoon, on the full record. He held her gaze. Kandahar, 2009, Mosul, 2011, the K9 integration program. A pause. The extraction in 2014. She said nothing. I owe you an apology, he said. You owe the dogs 42 hours, she said, which they'll get back over the next several months. He looked at her, the look of a man who expected a particular response and received a different one and is working to locate his position. That's not... He stopped. That's a generous way to receive an apology. I'm not being generous, she said. I'm being accurate. What you did, the paperwork, the deadline, the conditional approval, none of that was personal malice. It was institutional inertia and insufficient information. She looked at the yard, where Bravo 3 was making a cautious investigation of the water station in the corner. I've worked within systems long enough to know the difference between a person who wants to cause harm and a process that causes harm because no one has pushed back against it hard enough. Crawford was quiet. The termination policy, she continued. For animals like these, someone needs to push back against it formally, not as a favor, but as a structural change. She looked at him. That's a project for a colonel, not for a civilian contractor. He held her gaze. There was something in his expression that had not been present in the previous day's interactions. Not chastened exactly, but recalibrated in a more fundamental way than chastened captures. I'll bring it to the review board, he said. Thank you. He turned to go, stopped. The document you had, he said. From NavSpec War. Ronan brought it? Yes. He nodded. He looked at Delta 7, who had raised his head to regard Crawford with the alert, neutral attention of a working dog assessing a non-threatening variable. Service doesn't seek recognition, Crawford said. It came out with the quality of something he was testing, a phrase he had landed on that he was not entirely sure was adequate. Willa looked at him. No, she said. But sometimes it needs to be seen. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she reached into her jacket pocket and produced the termination notice. The original, the one that had been posted in the kennel block Monday afternoon, the one that listed 14 names and identification numbers and a scheduled date and time. She held it out to him. He took it, puzzled. Keep it, she said. Read it the next time you sign something like that. Not as a punishment, as a habit. The names on a document are always attached to something that didn't choose to be there. He looked at the paper, looked at her, gave her a single careful nod. The nod of a man filing something he intends to carry. She turned back to the yard, and Delta 7 pressed close against her side, and Crawford walked back toward the administrative wing, with the termination notice folded in his hand, and something different in the set of his shoulders than what he'd arrived with. The base entered its evening quiet by 18:30. The administrative offices dimmed. The activity on the main thoroughfares settled into the reduced rhythm of a place after its working hours. Willa stayed in the yard until the last of the 14 dogs had eaten and returned to the kennels voluntarily, which was itself an event, each animal moving under its own directed will, back through the kennel block and into their enclosures without the coercion of leash or command, simply following the sequence she established and the particular gravity of an environment that had, in the past 6 hours, begun to feel different to them. Silas locked the gates at 1905. Holly had left at 1800 and come back at 1840 with a container of food she hadn't asked permission to bring, which she set on the supply shelf without ceremony and which Willa ate sitting on an upturned crate with Delta 7's head in her lap. "Monday," Holly said, sitting across from her. "Evan's coming at 0530. Are you going to be here? I'm here every morning. I mean, are you staying long term?" Holly looked at her with the directness she'd been building towards since Tuesday morning. "Because Jasper offered you something, I'm guessing. Something bigger than kennel maintenance contracts." "He did," Willa said. "And?" "I said 6 months." Holly absorbed this. 6 months here? 6 months building the program, Willa said. The rehabilitation framework, the handler pairing methodology, the intake protocol. She looked at the kennels. 14 dogs here, potentially 41 others at other facilities, possibly more. She let that sit in the air between them. Someone has to build the architecture, someone who knows what these animals need and what the system is likely to get wrong about providing it. Holly looked at her for a long moment. "And after 6 months?" Willa looked at Delta 7. He had shifted in her lap so that his chin rested on her forearm, and his eyes were on her face with the steady, uncomplicated attention of an animal that has decided something and is not reconsidering it. "I'll answer that question," she said, "when it's the question." Holly nodded. She picked up her coffee, looked at the kennel block, and said, "For what it's worth, I knew something was different about you. From the first day. I just thought you were, I don't know, an overqualified person in an underqualified job, which I guess is technically accurate." Willa looked at her sideways. "Is that what you're going to tell people?" "I was thinking the most competent civilian contractor in the history of the base. That's diplomatic." "I'm a very diplomatic person," Holly said, which was almost entirely false, and both of them knew it, and the small shared recognition of that was its own kind of warmth. At 21:15, when the kennel block had been quiet for nearly 2 hours and the overhead lights had shifted to their reduced overnight setting, Willa sat alone at the corner desk. The 47 pages of completed paperwork had been processed, stamped, approved, and filed. The termination list had been formally rescinded, a 2-line administrative document, considerably less dramatic in its physical dimensions than the 42 hours it had taken to produce it. The 14 animals were settled in their enclosures with the particular quality of rest that belongs to animals who have been through a period of uncertainty and arrived, without fully understanding the mechanism, somewhere safer. She reached into her pocket and took out the challenge coin that Ronan had left on the conference room table. She turned it over in her fingers. The front bore the designation of Naval Base Coronado. The back bore a different marking, the unit insignia of a formation that did not appear in publicly available military records, a formation that maintained its operational existence through the classified architecture of a system that did not discuss itself in ordinary documentation. She set the coin on the desk, looked at it. Her phone was on the desk beside it, the phone that had received at 2011 minutes earlier a message from a number she did not have saved and did not need to save, a message that consisted of a set of geographic coordinates and a date 3 months away, and a single word that functioned as both a question and a statement, the way certain words do when they are used by people who know each other well enough to compress entire conversations into a single syllable. "Ready?" She had not responded yet. She looked at the coordinates. She knew the general theater, not the specific location, not the operational details, but the regional designation, and what it typically meant when someone with Harris's operational history sent coordinates in that area with that level of urgency. 41 dogs, 14 here, 41 there, approximately, possibly more. A network of animals that had been through operational theaters, that had been trained at a level of sophistication that most people in the general public would find startling, that had handler bonds in some cases and no handler bonds in others, and had returned from deployments into systems that were not built for what they carried back with them. She thought about what Reyes would have wanted. She thought about what Delta 7 had been. Not the animal that spent 90 days attacking handlers from the right side, but the animal that had walked out of an enclosure at the sound of a name he recognized and had not left her side since. She thought about the gap between what an animal is capable of and what a system is capable of seeing. She picked up her phone. She typed, 6 months, then we talk. Sent it. Set the phone down. Delta 7, in his enclosure 3 rows away, shifted. She heard the sound of his movement, the particular weight and cadence of it, as recognizable to her as a specific voice. He settled. The kennel block was quiet. She put the challenge coin back in her pocket. She stood up, walked the length of the kennel block, past Bravo 3, past Echo 9, past the 12 others in sequence, and stopped at enclosure 14. Delta 7 was lying facing the door, his chin on his paws, his eyes open. She crouched down. She looked at him, and he looked at her, with the mutual recognition of 2 things that have been through the same set of events from different angles and have arrived at the same understanding about where they are now. "We're staying," she said. The way she said it wasn't declarative. It was the confirmation of something already decided. "All of us." His tail moved. Once, she stood up, turned off the last overhead light, walked toward the door. At the exit, she stopped. She said it to the kennel block, to the darkness of it, to the 14 breathing animals distributed through it, to the particular quality of a space that had been something different 4 days ago and was something different now, not leaving anyone behind. The door swung shut behind her, and the kennel block settled into its overnight quiet, and in enclosure 14, Delta 7 put his chin back on his paws, closed his eyes, and breathed the deep and even breath of an animal that has at last stopped waiting. Every dog on that list had been written off, every single one, and the woman who refused to write them off had been written off twice as hard. If this story reminded you that loyalty doesn't wear a rank, share it with someone who needs to hear that today. Subscribe for more stories like this one, and tell us in the comments, what would you have done in Willa's place? 3 months later, on a Tuesday morning in January, the first intake arrived. 3 dogs from a naval air station in Lemoore, California, all 3 with behavioral classifications that had landed them on termination lists at their respective facilities before a facility review, triggered by a new DoD policy directive on military working dog welfare that had been submitted to the review board by one Colonel Crawford and approved in late November, flagged their cases for reallocation to specialized rehabilitation programs. The specialized rehabilitation program they were reallocated to was the one operating out of the kennel block at Coronado, which had been formally designated after 6 weeks of documentation, facility upgrades, and veterinary compliance review as the Naval K-9 Rehabilitation and Handler Integration Center. The designating paperwork had been signed by Admiral Jasper. The operational director listed on the certification documentation was Commander W. Richardson on a special assignment classification that did not appear in the public-facing staff directory but existed in the system with full operational authority. Evan arrived every morning at 0530. He had learned 11 of the 32 operational K-9 command signals in the classified protocol, which put him ahead of anyone who had attempted the same curriculum in the previous decade. He still brought his own coffee. He had stopped expecting Willa to share hers. Dr. Peterson had submitted 3 research papers on trauma response in military working dogs, all of them drawing on observational data from the rehabilitation program. The first was under review. The second had already been cited by the DODK-9 Welfare Committee in their policy revision and documentation. The third was the most technically detailed and, she considered privately, the best work of her career. Fletcher had visited the facility twice. Both times he stayed longer than he announced he would. Both times he left with the expression of a man who has been shown something and is thinking through its implications. Delta 7 was not being redeployed. This had been a deliberate decision, discussed with Dr. Peterson and with Jasper, and ultimately made by Willa. Some animals come back from operational theaters, and what they need is not another mission. What they need is to be somewhere permanent, with someone permanent, and to not be asked to be anything other than what they already are. He slept at the foot of her cot in the small quarters she'd been assigned in the facility. He ate at the same time every morning. He walked the perimeter of the yard with her at 0445, before the rest of the facility stirred into its daily noise, in the particular companionable silence of 2 things that have been through something together and have reached the other side of it. She had not answered the phone when Harris called again in December. She had sent a message, not yet. He had not pushed. She would answer it eventually. She knew that. The operational architecture that Ghost Shepherd represented. The 41 dogs at various facilities with various outcomes pending. That was not a thing she could step back from indefinitely, and she had not promised herself she would try. What she had promised herself was that she would build the foundation correctly before she allowed the foundation to be used as a platform for something larger. 6 months, she had said, then they would talk. 3 months in, the foundation was holding. On the Tuesday morning, when the 3 dogs from Lemoore arrived, Willa stood at the kennel intake gate with Evan and Dr. Peterson and watched the transport vehicle park and the handlers emerge. The handlers were young, both of them junior enlisted, with the specific combination of confidence and uncertainty that belongs to people who know their job and are not sure they know this particular version of it. She had met that expression before. She walked to the vehicle. The dogs were in the transport enclosures in the back, a Belgian Malinois, a German Shepherd, and a Labrador Retriever with a classification she'd never seen paired with a lab before. She looked at each of them in sequence, and they looked back with the various expressions of animals who have learned to assess what they're being presented with before deciding how to respond. The Malinois looked at her for a long time. She reached into her jacket pocket, took out the challenge coin, held it for a moment. Not a ritual, just a habit, the way certain objects become anchors for certain types of thinking. She put it back. "Let's get started," she said to Evan. He had his notebook out. He was ready. Behind her, inside the facility, 14 dogs were going about their morning, eating, moving, responding to the routines that had become, over 3 months, the architecture of a new ordinary. Delta 7 was at the yard gate, watching her, with the specific patience of an animal that knows you're coming back. She turned and walked into the intake process, and the work that had been in front of her for 3 months. The slow, careful, case-by-case work of returning to animals what systems had concluded they no longer deserved, continued in the ordinary way of things that are built to last, not with ceremony, not with announcement, just with the daily, unglamorous commitment of someone who said they would be there and is.